I'm Caroline Harrington. I'm a private client partner at gunnercooke, and I am based in the Manchester office. And this is sunny Ramsbottom, where I live, though it's not that sunny today, so it's a bit of a fake picture.
Brilliant. Helen Rooney, otherwise known as Neil Sullivan.
I'm Helen Rooney, commercial dispute resolution partner at gunnercooke. Yes, sorry, I'm down as Neil Sullivan today, which is my husband, so I am Helen Rooney, really. I cover the broad range of commercial disputes, breach of contract claims, recovery of money, shareholder partnership disputes, act for a broad range of clients, businesses, individuals, SMEs, larger corporations, so the full range.
Lovely. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Spink and I'm an employment lawyer based in Chorley in Lancashire. I help employment law queries. I help with employment law queries. HR professionals and small and medium-sized businesses tend to be my client range. So any HR issues, do let me know.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm Sian Darlington. I'm a business crime and regulatory solicitor at gunnercooke. So I act for individuals and businesses who are alleged to have done some sort of wrongdoing, and I also help businesses with their obligations to avoid themselves falling foul of the criminal law. So today's 10 top tips in 20 minutes is returning to work after lockdown, and we're going to give you 10 tips for a smooth transition. I'm going to start with tip number 1. Health and safety considerations. This is top of the list for many businesses returning to the workplace. Businesses have a legal obligation to protect their employees or anyone who might use their premises, both in terms of ensuring that premises are safe and in protecting the physical and emotional well-being of staff. And breach of the duty is a criminal offence, so very serious. The health and safety executive, who are responsible for ensuring compliance, their powers range from giving advice, issuing enforcement notices, right up to criminal prosecution, both corporate of the business and of its officials. So what do businesses need to do in practice? Well, all businesses are required by law to carry out a risk assessment. And if there are 5 or more staff, that assessment needs to be in writing. Because COVID-19 is a new risk, all businesses need to review their existing risk assessments or carry out a new one before employees return to work. But the good news is the process is reasonably straightforward. So 6 simple steps. Firstly, consult the new government guidance on working safely. There are different guides depending on the type of business. Secondly, identify the risks or the hazards. So think about the layout of your workplace, the nature of the work that you're carrying out, and any staff vulnerabilities. It's really important to talk to your staff because they might have some good ideas or day-to-day knowledge that you don't know about. Number 3, assess the level of risk. How likely is it that someone could be harmed, and how serious would it be if they were? Number 4, control the risk. Can the hazard be eliminated? If not, what reasonably practicable measures can be taken so that the likelihood of harm is reduced? And what is reasonably practicable isn't defined in the law, but it generally involves weighing up the risk against the compensating against it in terms of money or time or trouble. Number 5, record your findings in writing. And number 6, keep under review to make sure that your controls are working and as new information and guidance comes to light. So if we move on to the second slide, which follows on from this, is really to think about the types of measures to prevent and mitigate against the risk of COVID in particular. So there are 5 key areas. Firstly, think about how you're going to implement social distancing. Is it possible in your workplace? Does the layout need to be altered? Do you need to have markings on the floor? Do you need to make changes to shared equipment? You might want to consider rotating staff or reducing staff hours or staggering the start times, both to limit the number of staff in the office at any one time and to assist with avoiding rush hour travel. Think about your communal areas, not just things like kitchens and toilets, but what about stairs and corridors and lifts? Do you need a policy to reduce the number of people who can use these facilities at any one time? Number 2, consider alternatives if social distancing isn't possible. So that might be using screens, using PPE. If you're taking payments using contactless means for doing that, it really depends on the nature of your business. If you are using PPE, there are rules around ensuring its adequacy, and failure to do so could again be a criminal offence. Number 3, implement a hygiene protocol. So everyone disinfects their hands on entering the building. Think about whether your workplace and the equipment need to be cleaned more frequently. Are your hand washing facilities adequate? And check the ventilation system in your building is working. Number 4, staff awareness. It's vital staff are aware, so provide training, provide regular updates, display posters and notices around the workspace. Consider how you're going to deal with any breaches of the policy by the staff. And number 5, staff physical and mental well-being. Consider any particular staff vulnerabilities, perhaps their age, underlying health conditions, pregnancy, if they have household members that are shielding. If you don't know that information already, gather it now. And it may also help to try and gauge some staff anxiety levels. And it may be some staff need to continue from working from home. Others may benefit from a phased return or reduced hours, especially while the schools are still off. Consider implementing a reporting procedure if a member of staff or someone in their household comes down with symptoms. And also remember that if a worker is diagnosed as having COVID-19 and there's reasonable evidence that it was caused by exposure at work, it needs to be notified to the HSE as a case of disease. I'll pass over to Rachel now.
Thanks, Sian. That was really helpful, and it feeds in to what I'm going to talk about, which is, I have to assume that you have listened to Sian's great suggestions and implemented them before we reach this stage, which is what happens if people refuse to come back to work. Now, it depends on the individual. As with many aspects of employment law, there is no one size fits all. If they're in a clinically vulnerable group, i.e. over 70s, or they have pre-existing conditions, and you can't allow them to work from home, then you should consider furloughing them as the first port of call, because that scheme is still available. They've extended it until October now. So that's something to consider. Forcing them to come back to work, notwithstanding the fact that they're in these vulnerable groups, could run the risk of a discrimination claim or a constructive dismissal claim, potentially, if they can establish that you've fundamentally breached an implied term of the trust and a term of their contract of employment. And possibly also a personal injury claim if they got ill, which is something else to think about. So you're best avoiding that if possible. If they have children and their children have not returned to school and they need to look after them, again, something to consider would be furloughing as an alternative, if they can't work from home, that is. Other things to consider would be things like unpaid parental leave. But because this is unpaid, I think furlough would be preferable, because then you get your costs back and they get 80% of their pay. So again, there's a risk of a discrimination claim potentially if you force people, notwithstanding their childcare situation, to return to work at the moment, given these unusual circumstances that we're in. The government has made clear that it expects employers to continue to be sympathetic to employees with caring responsibilities and to work with them to try and find the best solution. So the normal rules that might apply to these sorts of situations, so for example, parental leave, it might be unpaid for a certain time and it will be with agreement, or emergency care, time off for dependents is just for an emergency period only, but you might be expected to give a bit more leeway, I think, in these situations. They'll give a bit longer. Now, if they're not in these categories and they're still refusing to return, the best thing to do, first of all, is to chat with them about what their concerns are and try and reach a solution. So, for example, if they're worried about the risk of infection on the commute, maybe you could give them a car parking space at the office as an alternative to avoid them catching the bus. They might have underlying physical or mental health conditions that you weren't aware of previously. So, for example, a hidden condition might be anxiety, which will cause them significant issues with returning to work. That should be addressed and dealt with sensitively, as it might amount to a disability potentially under the Equality Act. So just be aware, even if you can't see things, it's always best to chat things through as best you can with employees, just to find out what's really going on. If none of these apply and they're still refusing to come back to work, maybe offer time off as holiday or unpaid leave. Now, if they refuse to do that as well, and you've knocked through quite a few barriers now, there is an argument that they are failing to obey a reasonable management instruction and that this is now a disciplinary matter. Now, I know people are divided as to whether or not this would be justified if you went on to dismiss. I wouldn't like to run that as a tribunal, put it that way, if I was acting for the employer. So you've got to be wary. I'm not saying it would never be reasonable, but I just think there'd be a lot of arguments from the employee that they haven't acted unreasonably at all. So just try and avoid that if at all possible, and keep the dialogue going is what I say. So I'll pass you on now to Caroline.
Hi. So I'm looking at then the well-being of your staff. So a constant theme in these unusual times is that we find ourselves unable to know what's going to happen next, to boldly go where no person has gone before. It's going to be a long time before the COVID cloud has gone. So as we've heard in our other 3 presentations, there are lots of things that need to be done to make safe working, but some of your employees will be back working, but some of them will still be working from home. So in the first instance, you still need to continue to care for those who are working from home, keeping in touch with them, encouraging them to have a routine, help them out by organising activities for them. Maybe it's a social quiz, maybe it's encouraging everyone to do Joe Wicks in the morning, or a Friday fizz to end the week. 1 in 2 people have said that they've struggled with social isolation, and 7 out of 10 people have said they have missed social interaction. So some of your staff will not be able to return to work when it comes to the ability to return to work due to the fact that they are shielding. So those need to be supported as well. Do not forget about them. It may well be that they are shielding for some time and your work gets back to normal, everyone is treated like it's normal, but these people are still having to shield, but are still working, and therefore are part of your work community. So in light of such, as I've just mentioned, keep in touch with them, keep their well-being well. Moving forwards and going back to work in the office, this may well cause a lot of anxiety for some of your colleagues. So in light of such, keep them updated. Do not ring them on a Sunday night telling them that they will be back in work on a Monday morning. Let them know what's occurring and manage them well. Let them know what you intend to do to create a safe work environment, and ask them for their suggestions, because they may be able to think out of the box and think of great ways to socially distance and work together. If you are employers, you have a duty of care to look after your staff and help with their mental health. Some people have the ability to get access to counselling through work, some don't. However, we all have the ability to have mental health champions, to have mental health groups, to have an open door policy to make people feel welcome, to create social groups with different businesses. And also, if you work, say, like at 53 King Street, the gunnercooke office, how about having a floor social group where there's an open door policy where you can speak to other people within other businesses about your anxieties. Look after each other, check in with everybody. Don't think because you're back at work everything's back to normal, and be kind. I'm not sure who slide 5 is, sorry.
Yes, it's my turn now.
Sorry.
Thanks, Caroline. The government has introduced some measures aimed at helping companies struggling from the economic effects of the pandemic, whilst also allowing businesses to protect jobs and directors during the current climate. So the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Bill has been published. Some of the proposed measures were to be introduced in any event to update the insolvency regime, to create more opportunities to rescue companies in difficulties, but there are others that are specifically temporary measures as a result of the pandemic. Just a couple I want to pick up on. Suspension of the wrongful trading provisions for a period of 3 months retrospective to the 1st of March, but likely to be extended beyond that period. So just as an aide-memoire really, wrongful trading provisions under the Insolvency Act provide protection to the company's creditors by imposing personal liability on directors of insolvent companies which continue to trade when the director knew or ought to have concluded there was no reasonable prospect that the company would avoid going into insolvent liquidation or administration. So those provisions are temporarily suspended, meaning that liquidators and administrators will be unable to bring claims against directors for wrongful trading or for any losses caused by trading during the current pandemic, and for losses for the March to June period. Now, whilst directors may not be liable for losses during this time, losses incurred before and or after the pandemic will still be relevant and still remain a factor. But as always, directors' duties to creditors still remain, so directors aren't off the hook. So they must act in good faith. They must promote the success of the company as they would normally do. The measures also don't impact on the existing laws relating to fraudulent trading, transactions defrauding creditors, and also misfeasance. So there is still the threat of directors' disqualification proceedings there. So directors should be mindful of their obligations and keep under consideration the question as to the company's future viability. As always, and even more so I think now, it's important to document what steps you've taken as a director and the reasons why you've taken those decisions in case it's called into question in the future. The second temporary measure under the bill is designed to restrict statutory demands and winding up petitions during the pandemic in circumstances where the debt is unpaid for reasons of the coronavirus. So the bill voids statutory demands made between March and the 30th of June and provides that a winding up petition cannot be presented by a creditor during that period. There are exceptions to every rule. So if a creditor has reasonable grounds for believing that coronavirus has not had any financial impact on the debtor's business, and the debtor would have been unable to pay its debts in the absence of the coronavirus in any event, they can still go ahead and petition for a winding up. The measures are really intended to prevent mass insolvencies at the moment, whilst also preventing creditors being heavy-handed in their actions during the pandemic. Also under the bill, the deadline for filing prescribed documents has been temporarily extended, so to prevent imposition of financial penalties, criminal sanctions, etc. The additional provisions really relate to permanent reform, set out alternative rescue options for companies seeking to restructure, as well as allowing formal breathing space to obtain a moratorium period which will allow companies to restructure, seek new investment and perhaps pursue other rescue plans. Suppliers will often threaten to stop supplying when a company has entered into a formal insolvency procedure. But under the new regime, a company's supplier won't be able to rely upon contractual terms and termination clauses to stop supplying, and there are certain safeguards for suppliers to ensure that supplies are paid for. So the government hopes that the measures contained within the bill will support business efforts during the pandemic and also allow them to navigate the economic impacts of COVID-19 and the economic recovery. So that brings me on to financial help available to businesses. Please, Helen, if you could just jump onto the next slide for me. Rachel has mentioned furlough, and everybody must be aware of the furlough scheme by now, so I'm not going to really touch on that. But I did hear an eye-watering figure the other day that the government is spending about £8 billion a month just on furlough, which is just staggering amounts of money that we're talking about at the moment. The coronavirus statutory sick pay rebate scheme has been introduced, and this is an online service which I think, if I'm right, is available from today, from the 26th of May online, which is designed to repay employers the statutory sick pay paid to current or former employees. So the repayment covers up to 2 weeks starting from the first qualifying day of sickness if an employee is unable to work because they have coronavirus symptoms, or they're self-isolating because somebody they live with has symptoms, and that period starts on the 13th of March, or they're shielding, they've got a letter from the NHS or the GP saying they need to stay at home for at least 12 weeks, and that period starts from the 16th of April. Now, employers can only claim the standard weekly rate of SSP, which I think is about £95 something. So if you're an employer who actually pays an additional rate on top of that, then you won't be able to claim that top up. you must have fewer than 250 employees on the 28th of February. And you can claim from both the furlough scheme and the statutory sick pay rebate scheme for the same employee, but not for the same period of time for that employee. As always, keep up-to-date records, and you have to retain those for at least 3 years. There are temporary changes to VAT payments, which may be due between 20th of March and the 30th of June to help businesses manage their cash flow. So you have the option to defer payments until a later date without penalties or interest, or obviously you can pay the VAT at the normal rate if you're able to. That's deferred until the 31st of March 2021, after which date those VAT payments must be made as normal. The time to pay arrangements still available to businesses and individuals with HMRC, those people who may be in financial distress at the moment. There's a similar rule for self-employed people for deferral of any self-assessment tax. That has to be paid before the 31st of January next year. Business rates relief. There is a business rates holiday which is available. It's been introduced for retail, hospitality and leisure businesses for the current tax year. So if your property is a shop, restaurant, cafe, bar, spa, gym, anything like that, hotel, bed and breakfast, then you can seek, well, the local authority should apply this discount automatically to you. It also applies, I think, to children's nurseries for the current tax year. There are various business support grant funds for smaller businesses to help with their business costs during the pandemic. Such businesses are entitled to a one-off payment of £10,000, provided the business was eligible for the small business rate relief in any event. The hospitality industry, further help for them at the moment. They're entitled to a one-off cash grant of up to £25,000 if, depending on the rateable value of their property. The support for self-employed people through the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, I think that scheme's actually been available since mid-May. People have to register through the government gateway, and I think people have been notified if they are entitled to it. But you are entitled to claim a taxable grant of 80% of your average monthly trading profits, paid out in a single instalment covering the 3-month period to the end of June, capped at a total of £7,500. Unlike the furlough scheme, you can continue to work during that period. The grant doesn't need to be repaid, but it is subject to tax and national insurance. You need to have been trading for at least 3 years and submitted self-assessment tax returns for that period, and also your business has been adversely affected by the coronavirus. There are various business interruption loans. There's been lots in the press about them. People seem to have had varying degrees of success in applying for them, and also the time it seems to have taken for the monies to actually land in your account. But there is help out there for small and medium-sized businesses and also larger businesses where the government will guarantee 80% of the loan to the lender and will pay interest and fees for the first 12 months. The last one I just want to touch on is the bounce back loan scheme. Again, there's been a mixed reaction, I think, really by way of time for getting this money through, but it does enable smaller businesses to access finance more quickly during the outbreak. There's a maximum loan of £50,000 and the government guarantees 80% of that loan with no interest or fees for the first 12 months. But after that, the rate I think is 2.5% and the loan will last for 6 years. So I'm sure businesses are aware there is help out there. You can defer payments where that's necessary. You can seek funding, seek help. HMRC, I think, will be receptive to requests for delaying payments, etc. They won't want businesses to fold. But as always, just keep your lines of communication open with funders, etc. So I think I'm passing on to Caroline now.
Hello. So travel considerations. So travel in the UK as well as international travel will be difficult for some time. We're going to have to think outside of the box. A lot of us are already doing online meetings like this one, so it may well be appropriate to invest in some sort of proper training for your colleagues and staff so that they can conduct these meetings in the most effective way. However, there's nothing that beats a face-to-face interaction. In light of such, travelling to meetings in London, Manchester and Birmingham on public transport will probably not be recommended or able to do easily. Therefore, you might want to consider travelling to different destinations and having meetings socially distant in areas where they're easier to get to, less traffic, less parking problems, and not putting people at risk being in packed city centres. There are lots of towns that have the ability to maybe rent an office space for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to facilitate having meetings. So just thinking about how you travel and where you travel to. The 14-day isolation will cause problems with people who are travelling abroad. Also, you need to be mindful if you do have any members of staff who go on holiday or go on a sabbatical or are currently on a sabbatical and have been able to return to the UK, that they will need to self-isolate for 14 days. Therefore, you do still need to have in place good working at home options for those who fall into that category, so you're not in any way prejudicing them. A few of you may well be employing foreign nationals, and you may have been hoping to employ foreign nationals who had visas that were due to commence during the lockdown period. Normally there's a 30-day timescale on these visas, but the government have thought pragmatically and extended them, so you can still look at employing those people on foreign nationals on visas. Also, if you've got any tier 2 people that are making applications, the process can still continue even though they can't do their biometric testing, but you can still put things in place. If you've got anybody that's travelled here on a work visa or a travel visa and that has expired during lockdown, don't worry, you can contact the Home Office, and those are currently being extended, not indefinitely, at the moment on a month-by-month basis. It's just important to realise that travel needs to continue and business needs to continue, but it needs to be done in a safe way. And we do need to encourage people to come to our country to still work, but again, doing it safely. Rachel.
Thanks, Caroline. Flexible working. I was puzzled by that picture until I realised she's flexibly working, isn't she? I think I wouldn't want to work like that, but yeah, clearly she can do. So what's this about? The pandemic has forced millions of employers to adopt a flexible working approach. So many employees are now required to work from home because they've got no other option. We think it's likely, therefore, that employers will face increased demand for flexible working after the pandemic has finished. So now is the time to review your flexible working policies so that you're ready to deal with any such requests after lockdown finishes. Now, there are benefits, as we've all found, to flexible working. You can make financial savings with reducing office space, for example, and having hot desks as opposed to fixed desk space. And many employees have reported that flexible working gives them a higher rate of job satisfaction, better work-life balance. It can also increase their ability to manage stress and their mental health. And remember that a happy employee is a more productive employee, so they are a greater asset to your business. In the UK, an employee with at least 26 weeks continuous employment can make a request for flexible working under the statutory scheme for any reason at all. It used to be the case that they had to be making the request on childcare grounds, but not anymore. You don't need a reason. Employers have a duty to respond to the request in a reasonable manner and within a 3-month period altogether. An employee is only entitled to make one request in a 12-month period, so you don't have to worry about people making multiple requests and having to go through the procedure several times, well, within a short period of time. If you anticipate receiving flexible working requests post-lockdown, then there's some things that you should probably think about doing. If you find out that an employee is thinking about making a request, speak to them at an early stage on an informal basis to find out what their individual needs and interests are, to try and assess them, and make sure you clearly communicate to your staff the rules of your flexible working policy, so that they know, they're clear as to what they can and they cannot do. Establish a clear process for flexible working with designated roles and responsibilities for your staff, and assess your employees who work on a flexible basis so that their rights, assure them that their rights will continue, and you will continue to support their career development as well. Now, a flexible working policy should include details on the following: how your employees can make such a request, who the request should be made to, and what should be included in their application, the process that you and they need to follow in order to accept or reject the request. If the request is rejected, explain how they can appeal, because that is part of the process, and the time limits on dealing with requests. Now, after lockdown restrictions are finished, if you're unsure as to whether an increase in flexible working or maintaining the current levels of flexible working is the right decision for your business, you could try running a trial period for people, for each employee who makes such a request. And at the end of the trial period, you could evaluate with them whether it's worked, what hasn't worked, and give feedback to employees as to how you wish to proceed in the future. Remember, you can reject a request for flexible working if you have a legitimate business reason for doing so, such as costs, detrimental impact on ability to meet customer demands, impact on quality, etc. That said, you do need to be careful not to inadvertently discriminate against somebody because of a protected characteristic that an employee might have when they're making their request. So that's something just to be aware of. Now, I'll pass you on to Sean, who's going to talk to you about technology.
Thanks, Rachel. So what are some of the trends we might expect to see in technology in the post-corona world? Well, firstly, the increased use of video conferencing has opened up the possibility of running not just one-to-one sessions and small meetings, but large-scale seminars, events, and even global conferences virtually, which means that people are going to be able to attend events that were previously precluded due to costs and travel constraints, which opens up massive possibilities for businesses, both in terms of running and attending such meetings and events. Secondly, and as been mentioned, I think in almost every slide, the anticipated rise in home working will continue, which is likely to impact on the physical workspace, with many businesses making changes in relation to their existing premises. Thirdly, data storage and infrastructure. Businesses will have a need to store a potentially increased amount of data due to home working, for reasons both of security and to prevent businesses from grinding to a halt in the event of a technological breakdown. Businesses may wish to store not only data, but the applications that they use in different cloud systems to ensure that if there is a problem, everything can continue smoothly. Fourthly, artificial intelligence. There has been a long-standing belief that AI will replace a large percentage of the workforce in the future, and it is likely that the virus will hasten this process. So some jobs may be lost forever, but on the other side, it's anticipated that new ones will be created. And finally, technology has an essential role to play in fighting the virus itself. It can help identify, track and forecast outbreaks. There are some interesting developments in China, a bit of a controversial one, but using surveillance systems with facial recognition and temperature detection software to identify people with a fever, perhaps ban them from public places. Drones and robots are being used to deliver food and supplies and to clean and sterilize equipment. Obviously, with robots, there's no risk of infection. So I think in summary, it's really worth businesses keeping on top of developments and thinking about ways in which technology can be used, not only to make their businesses more cost effective, but also to make their businesses safer. So I'll pass you over to Helen.
Yes, thanks, Sean. Just to wrap up, really, moves are obviously afoot now to start the slow process of bringing the country out of lockdown. So I thought it may be helpful to just have a look at what lessons we've learned and a sort of post-lockdown business checklist almost. It certainly has been a roller coaster for everyone, both in terms of business and professional lives, as well as our family and personal lives. I don't think anybody is exempt from that. Most people, as Rachel's mentioned, have been working from home. For some people, that will have been perhaps an enjoyable experience, welcome relief from the daily grind of a commute into the office. For others, it will have been fraught with difficulties juggling childcare, perhaps illness within the household, perhaps loneliness. Caroline's mentioned mental health. If you live and you work alone, it can be very, very difficult. So going forward, how will this work for your business and your employees? Rachel's mentioned additional requests now for working from home, flexible working. So think about how flexible or agile working would work for you as a business. Is this something that is new for you perhaps? Analyse your staffing levels within your return to work plan. Are your flexible working policies sufficient? Do you need to review how you operate in this new climate? We've mentioned keeping in touch with staff, but internal communication strategy is very important. It's crucial to ensure that everyone within the business knows what's expected of them and any appropriate parameters to work within. Keep in touch with your team, your employees, and understand any concerns they may have. Identify any competitive advantages that you may have now, or that may have come to light during the period. Are there any weaknesses in your direct or indirect competitors? Any gaps in the marketplace which you think you can fill now, which might help you when you're back in the big wide world? Stay close to existing and previous clients and customers. We've all had to adapt over the past 9 or 10 weeks to different ways of working, keeping in touch. So whether this is done by email, social media, good old telephone, video calls, whatever's appropriate and whatever works for you, keep in touch with your customers. They will feel valued and looked after, which can only help you in the long run. Think about your pipeline of work. What's happened whilst you've been working from home and during the last few months? What's happened with work, referrals, your contracts, work which may have dropped off, but also other opportunities which may have come to light, and any positives that you can think of whilst in lockdown. This will help you to assess the level of activity when things start to get up and running. It may not be near full activity for many, many months, depending on your area of work, until the market and economic confidence picks up, but you can be ready when it does. So think about your supply chain, your staffing levels, your order backlog. And financially, once again, be sure to have a detailed cash flow forecast and good management information. It's crucial really to making good business decisions, as well as giving you visibility over any liabilities which you might have deferred, any delayed payments, and the dates when they now become due. It may also highlight any additional funding requirements, as well as helping you to fine-tune your exit from lockdown strategy. So I hope that's been helpful. Just wondered if anyone would perhaps like to share any experiences, good or bad, from the lockdown, or any tips for easing your way back into what will become the new normal for us all.